Welcome everyone, this is Dr. Matson. So this is covering innate behavior patterns and habituation for this week. So we always want to take a look at how built-in or innate behaviors are and how they work, how habituation modifies responses with repetition. And so we look at different characteristics of goal-directed systems. And so a goal system would be to set the point, look at the sensor, the comparator, the effector, behavior corrections or deviations from a topic. Many behaviors look purposeful because of the negative feedback loops. And so some of these goal directed systems that we see here is what we'll get into a little bit deeper as we go throughout this PowerPoint. So to go through an example, we look at terminology of control systems theory, and we use a house's heating example here to help explain this. And so, we map out the different parts. And so there's the thermostat, okay? The thermostat would be the sensor comparator. The furnace would be the effector. The room temp would be the output. And then we use it to kind of preview a biological control, something like posture, temperature, and even some action sequences here as well. So to briefly cover what reflexes are, these are fast, we typically stereotype responses to kind of fit a specific stimulus that's adaptive and protective, in contrast with voluntary acts, which reflexes, require minimal processing and are highly reliable. But reflexes in a newborn infant, we look at things like rooting, sucking, grasping, the moral reflex when the babies hear the sound and they just jump, like, kind of that startling effect. But we look at kind of the developmental value, which would be like feeding or bonding, as well as the age of, disappearance as the cortex starts to mature. The spinal reflex arc is like the outline path, and that's the receptor, which takes us to the sensory neuron, and then to the inner neuron, and then the efferent would be the motor neuron, and then to the muscle. And, you really want to emphasize the speed and the local processing in the spinal cord, as to how quickly this whole process of the spinal arc reflex happens. The sensory neurons, sensory inputs to the CNS, the central nervous system. The interneurons are a local processing integration or motor to the output to the effectors. And then the complex reflexes chain multiple interneurons for modulation. And looking at the feedback in the spinal reflex arc, we look at negative feedback, which stabilizes posture, like a stretch reflex, or descending brain signals can also facilitate or inhibit spinal circuits. So the context of, the reflex is what matters here. Tropisms are taxis and kinsis is what we look at here. And so the taxis is directed movement towards or away from something. It's directional movements that we elicit by a stimulus. So it gives you the example here, maggots' reaction to light, ants using the sun as a compass, right? So it's very directional in its intent. And the kinesis, the rate changes with the stimulus. So it's non-directional movements. We look at like humidity seeking by the woodlouse. The woodlouse's behavior as a feedback system. It's mostly seen in simpler organisms that show some kind of stimulus bond movement without any kind of complex decision making. Okay, so we have sequences of behavior here on this slide. And so many species show some type of stereotyped action sequences that unfold reliably. And so we have the fixed action patterns, FAPs for short, and the reaction chains. And the fixed action patterns, the species are typical, they're rigid, they're triggered by a specific sign stimulus. Once started, it tends to run to completion. They have low flexibility. It's efficient for recurrent survival tasks. And then if we look at, like, let's say a squirrel, for example, a squirrel's nut bearing, which illustrates, the FAP steps. So they would dig, they would place, they would cover, They tamper, even like naive juveniles show the sequence pointing to innate organization. But it's triggered by some kind of a sign or some kind of stimulus, right? And so they define the releaser, which would be the key stimulus that unlocks the FAP, which emphasizes stimulus configuration or shape or motion over fine details. And so we highlight the limited or the limitness in the sequence, which is rigid and unchanging. And so once it's initiated, the behavior tends to proceed. There's a survival advantage like speed, efficiency versus something like cost or inflexibility. And then we have a supernormal stimuli, which is more exaggerated sign that stimuli can elicit stronger than normal responses, like a larger or brightly colored egg. It shows the tuning of perceptual triggers, not necessarily intelligence per se. The reaction chains is more like ordered, so it's S to R links, and each response produces the next eliciting stimulus. So the more flexible the FAP's sequence can pause or change with environment, the better response or reaction chain we're going to get. And so we have this sequence of stimulus response connections where you walk through stimulus A, goes to response 1, creates stimulus B, which goes to response 2, etc. If a stimulus is missing, then the chain stalls until it appears. So if we look at this with a hermit crab, or a hermit crab that's shell seeking, we use this as the classic reaction chain example. And so you detect the shell, you inspect it, you flip it, you enter, you adjust. Each step depends on the current sensory context, showing some kind of flexibility. And so with the sequence being flexible to some extent, we want to emphasize adaptability. And some steps can be skipped, repeated based on conditions. It has to be a good fit for variable environments as well. So we want that sequence to, stay flexible. So looking at the innate human behaviors and predispositions, humans have reflexes like sucking, grasping. They have predispositions. They have face preference, language readiness, things like that. John Locke says they were born with a blank slate, nothing, and everything in life is learned. Some people believe that, some people not, but that's a whole other debate on whether or not you believe that. Habituation is another concept here, and with that we see a decline in responding after repeated or inconsequential stimulation. So it conserves energy, attention for novel or important events. And so you can see a little bit of Ekman's research here with facial expressions. Looking at decreases in reflex responses with repetition, there's a core property in the stimulus-specific or spontaneous recovery dishabituation with a new stimulus. This is all factors into the rehabilitation later. And so intensity or frequency shapes the rate. Habituation is the orienting response. And so orienting would be like, what's that? The response, head, eye turn, skin, conductance, it diminishes with repetition of a harmless stimuli. So when we look at the example of the rats from your text, the responses to a cat odor, there's a strong initial reaction. So we see like freezing or avoidance. If the odor is repeatedly non-contingent, the response can decline. And, the caveat would be that you're biologically prepared threats that may habituate more slowly. There's general principles of habituation. These kind of contrast with sensitization or response increases, and it's set up with neural mechanisms next. And so we see the general principles here. We have the course of habituation, the effects of time, the relearning effects, the effects of the stimulus, the intensity of it, effects of overlearning, and then the stimulus generalization. And so using habituation, we have done research that measures infants' abilities. And so habituation can look at psychological functioning as well. we would study both habituation and psychological functioning. The habituation, like the neural mechanisms for this, are often due to synaptic depression at sensory or motor synapses. So we have fewer vesicles released and smaller postsynaptic responses as well. With our marine snail example, it's chosen for its simple mapped circuited, classic preparation for learning. It allows direct recording and identified synapses. You can see in the diagram here of the marine snail, you see the gill withdrawal reflex, repeated tactile stimulation or reduced gill withdrawal is amplitudes. And so the mechanism we see is the decreased neurotransmitter release from the siphon sensory neurons. And then when we see the decrease in neurotransmitter, which happens during habituation, there's a short-term presynaptic vessel or vesicle that depletes. And so this is the CA2 plus channel changes. So longer-term structural changes equals fewer synaptic contacts. When the habituation in the rat's startle reflex, we have this loud tone and you see the whole body jerk again, like I mentioned with the infants and the Moro reflex. This is going to decline across trials. And so the circuit shows that contribution happens in the central area, not only the peripheral synapses. And if we look at this with the human brain, we do imaging, ERPs, or reduced cortical, subcortical responses to repeated neutral stimuli. And there's a clinical angle. So impaired habituation appears in some disorders as well. With the opponent process theory or emotional habituation, emotions show two components, fast A process and slower B process that opposes it. Repetition changes the B process dynamics. And so the temporal pattern of an emotional response is that the plot idea or the stimulus onset moves into a strong process, and then B process lags, and then it counteracts and outlasts the offset after the reaction in this. So in this example, we see a student's reaction to a good grade. Their initial thrill is followed by a settling kind of after state. So the initial thrill is A, the settling after state would be B. With repetition, the thrill may shrink. The after state may then grow. But then if we look at A process would be fast versus the B process is slow. A is tied to stimulus intensity. It's quick on, quick off. B is slower to start or stop. It increases with experience. And the effects of repeated stimulation, B process strengthens. So it starts sooner, it peaks higher, it decays slower. It explains tolerance or diminished A and stronger opposites after reaction. And the B process dynamics strengthen the onset delay. They summarize the functional outcomes like tolerance, withdrawal like after effects, and emotional leveling with repetition as well. And that's what you kind of see here on this diagram, that I mentioned on the last slide, actually, with the effects of repeated stimulation and the B process strengthening or starting sooner, peaking, decaying slower, looking at tolerance, withdrawal-like effects, that type of thing is what we see in this diagram. And lastly, on this page or slide, we have the dog examples. And so dogs and shocks equals kind of a less overt fear during the shock tolerance, stronger agitation when it ends. So that's the after effect. If we look at parachutists, there's people that parachute, that jump from the plane. Terror, thrill adaptation, experienced jumpers typically show different curves. The opiates, there's a euphoria that diminishes. The opponent after effects intensify, and then there's a basis for dependence that follows. So those are our three examples here. And so a couple things you just kind of want to wrap up, or as we wrap up here, key takeaways would be that innate systems, like the reflexes, the FAPs, the reaction chains, these provide efficient defaults. Habituation tunes responsiveness or opponent process, explains emotional change over time. And so together, They show how simple mechanisms yield adaptive experiences in shaped behavior. I hope you enjoyed listening, and I will see you again.